What happens when a 14-year-old girl discovers a flaw in physics that the world's smartest men missed for 63 years? What happens when she brings that discovery documented, derived, mathematically airtight into a room full of Nobel Prize winners, and they laugh at her? What happens when she doesn't break? Doesn't leave, doesn't apologize for knowing what she knows? What happens next is still shaking the scientific community in 2026. This is the story of a 14-year-old black girl from Baltimore who walked into the inner circle of the world's most decorated physicists, the successors of Einstein, the keepers of equations that had stood unchallenged for over 6 decades, and showed them, line by line, exactly where they had been wrong. She was mocked, she was dismissed. She was given 4 minutes to explain 14 months of work by a man who had already decided she didn't belong in the room. She set the marker down. She waited. And then she came back. The room had gone completely silent, not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the next speaker, not the respectful hush of a crowd listening carefully. This was something else entirely. This was the silence of 37 of the world's most decorated scientists, Nobel laureates, department chairs, published authors whose combined research had shaped the last 5 decades of modern physics, sitting perfectly still, staring at a 14-year-old girl standing at a whiteboard. Their mouths were slightly open, their eyes were wide. And the equations she had just written, equations that shouldn't have been possible, equations that contradicted what they had spent their careers believing, were still drying on the board behind her. One of the men in the front row, a man who had won the Nobel Prize in physics just 3 years earlier, slowly reached up and removed his glasses. He rubbed his eyes. He put them back on. And he looked at the board again, because what he was seeing couldn't be real, but it was real. And this is the story of how it happened. This is the story of Amara Osei, 14 years old. From a 2-bedroom apartment in Baltimore, Maryland, daughter of an immigrant nurse and a school bus driver, a girl who had never set foot in a university lecture hall before that morning. A girl who just 6 hours earlier had been laughed out of that very same room. Before we get to the moment that left the greatest scientific minds in the world speechless, we need to go back. Back to where Amara started, because that part of the story matters just as much as the ending, maybe more. Amara Osei woke up every morning at 5:15, not because anyone made her. Not because she had to catch an early bus or open a store. She woke up at 5:15 because that was the only quiet time she had. The only hour in the day when the apartment wasn't filled with the sounds of her younger brothers arguing, her mother preparing for her nursing shift, or the bass from Mr. Patterson's television bleeding through the wall from next door. 5:15 in the morning, in the kitchen of their apartment on Lanville Street in West Baltimore, with a cup of tea going cold beside her notebook. That was Amara's time. That was when she did her real thinking. The notebook was her 3rd this year. The cover was black, worn soft at the corners from being carried everywhere. Inside, in handwriting that was small and precise and slightly tilted to the left, were pages and pages of equations, diagrams, theories. Questions written in red ink, with arrows pointing to partial answers and more questions branching off from those. To most people walking by, it would have looked like the private language of someone extraordinary. And it was. But Amara didn't think of herself as extraordinary. That word had never felt right to her. Extraordinary implied that she was separate from her world, elevated above it, and she was not separate from anything. She was deeply, completely a part of every ordinary detail of her life. She was the girl who helped her mother, Abina, hang IV bags during double shifts at Johns Hopkins on the evenings. Her mom was too tired to lift her arms. She was the girl who made her brothers, 7-year-old Kofi and 9-year-old Emmanuel, eat breakfast before school even when they protested. She was the girl who had memorized every pothole on the number 22 bus route, who knew which librarian at the Enoch Pratt Free Library would let you stay past closing if you were quiet, who could tell you the exact number of steps from their apartment door to the corner store and back. She was grounded, she was present, she was responsible in the way that kids who grow up in families stretched thin by work and worry learn to be responsible. And she was also, without any question, a genius. Amara had known she thought differently since she was 6 years old. That was the year she'd sat in the back of her father's school bus one afternoon while he finished his route. And she'd watched the way light hit the windshield and started asking questions, not the questions a 6-year-old was supposed to ask, but questions about angles and refraction, and why colors bent differently through glass than through water. She'd gone home that evening and drawn it all out in a spiral notebook she borrowed from her mother's work bag. Her first-grade teacher, Mrs. Donnelly, had noticed immediately. Then her second-grade teacher. By fourth grade, the school had quietly arranged for Amara to sit in on seventh-grade math. By seventh grade, she was attending weekly sessions with a retired physicist named Dr. Gerald Owens, who volunteered at a STEM program in their neighborhood. A quiet, gentle, white-haired man who had spent 40 years at NASA, and who, within 3 sessions of meeting Amara, had told her parents with complete seriousness, "I don't say this lightly. Your daughter sees things in numbers that I have never seen in a student, not in 40 years. Amara's father, Quame, had smiled politely and said thank you. He was a man of measured words and careful trust. He had come to America from Ghana at 22 with $60 and a mechanical engineering degree that American employers had spent years finding reasons not to honor. He had learned not to let other people's enthusiasm about his family become the measure of his family's worth. But Abina, her mother, Abina, had cried, quietly in the car on the drive home. Not because she was surprised. She had always known. She had watched her daughter look at the world differently since before the girl could walk. She cried because she was relieved. Because someone else could finally see it too. The year Amara turned 13, Dr. Owens introduced her to something that would consume her completely. He called it the boundary problem. It wasn't a textbook concept. It wasn't part of any curriculum. It was, as Dr. Owens explained it over 2 cups of Earl Grey tea in the community center's back office. A gap in modern physics that nobody talked about publicly, but that anyone paying close attention knew was there. It had to do with the behavior of light at extreme energy thresholds. Specifically, the way that certain particles seem to violate their own predicted patterns when introduced to what physicists called boundary conditions, the edges of theoretical models where the math was supposed to hold firm but, in practice, kept producing anomalies that researchers quietly filed away and moved past. Why do they move past it? Amara had asked. Dr. Owens had looked at her over his glasses. Because the anomalies are inconvenient, he said simply. Because accepting them would mean reconsidering things that very important people spent very important careers establishing. Amara had written that down in red ink. Inconvenient anomalies. Why do we ignore what doesn't fit? And that question became the seed of everything that followed. For the next 14 months, Amara worked on the boundary problem the way other teenagers worked on college applications. Systematically, obsessively. With a level of focus that occasionally alarmed the people around her. She read every paper she could access through the library's database. She watched recorded lectures from MIT OpenCourseWare until her eyes burned. She wrote to 3 university physics departments asking for guidance and received 1 polite form letter response, 1 silence, and 1 reply from a graduate student who had assumed, based on the email address, that they were corresponding with a senior researcher. When that graduate student discovered that Osei was a 13-year-old girl from Baltimore, the correspondence stopped, but Amara kept going. Because the math was starting to do something she hadn't expected. The deeper she went into the anomalies, the more she began to see a pattern, not a random error, not a data problem. A consistent, repeatable deviation that pointed towards something that, if it held, would mean that one of the foundational equations in modern particle physics, an equation that had stood unchallenged for over 60 years, was incomplete. She told Dr. Owens on a Tuesday evening in October. He sat very still for a long time after she showed him her work. Then he said quietly, "Amara, if this is right and I need time to check it very carefully, then what you've found is not a small thing." She already knew that. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was what that discovery would cost her before it was finally believed. The International Young Scholars Physics Symposium was held every 2 years in Washington, D.C. It was prestigious by academic standards, a gathering of established researchers, department heads, and invited young scientists from around the world. Designed to bridge the gap between emerging talent and established expertise. The keynote speakers were routinely Nobel laureates. The registration fees alone were more than Quame made in a week. Dr. Owens had submitted Amara's application himself. He had written the recommendation letter personally and attached a summary of her research, noting specifically that she was 13, now 14, and that what she had found deserved serious academic consideration. He had called in a favor from a former colleague who sat on the selection committee, and against every quiet instinct that told him the world would not be ready, he had gotten her in. Amara's slot was listed in the program as a Young Scholar Spotlight, a 15-minute presentation opportunity given to exceptional students. She was scheduled for 10 o'clock on the first morning. She had prepared for 6 weeks. She had rehearsed the presentation so many times that her mother could recite parts of it from memory just from hearing it through the wall at night. The morning of the symposium, Abina pressed Amara's blouse with care, and Quame drove her the 40 miles to the conference center in his school bus, which made Amara smile despite her nerves. Because there was something wonderful and completely right about arriving at a place like this the way she arrived everywhere. She walked into the conference room at 9:45, notebook under her arm, presentation printed and bound in a navy blue folder. There were already about 20 people in the room. Most of them were men. Most of them were significantly older than her father. Several were wearing name badges with institutional affiliations that Amara recognized from papers she had studied for over a year. She found a seat near the front and sat down quietly. Nobody looked at her. Or rather, a few people looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't quite fit the expected picture and then looked away. One man, seated 3 chairs to her left, leaned toward his colleague and said something in a low voice. His colleague glanced at Amara, then back at him, and they both made an expression that wasn't quite a smile. Amara saw it. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the feeling she'd learned to name and set aside without letting it show on her face. She opened her notebook. She reviewed her notes one more time. She was ready. What she was not ready for was Dr. Charles Whitmore. Dr. Whitmore was 61 years old. He was the session chair for the morning presentations. He had a CV that ran to 14 pages, a Nobel Prize in physics from 11 years ago, and a manner of speaking that made every sentence sound like the conclusion of an argument he had already won. He stood at the front of the room at 9:58 and introduced the morning's agenda briskly, moving through the scheduled speakers with the efficiency of a man whose time was extremely valuable. When he reached Amara's slot, he paused. He looked at the program. He looked up. His eyes found her, the only teenager in the room, the only black face in the front section, sitting straight-backed and still with a navy blue folder in her hands. He looked back at the program. Young Scholar Spotlight, he read aloud. Then, with a tone that was almost too casual to be intentional, he said, "Right, we'll get through that quickly." Amara's jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly, she set her notebook on the table. She breathed once, slowly, the way her mother had taught her. You don't have to react to every slight, baby. Save your energy for what matters. And what mattered was the math. She would show them the math. What she didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that by the time she reached the front of that room to present, the situation would be far worse than she could have imagined. The first 2 presentations ran long. A researcher from the University of Edinburgh presented a paper on quantum entanglement behavior that drew respectful questions. A professor from Caltech followed with a dense but well-received discussion of particle decay models. By the time Amara was called up, it was 10:47, 17 minutes behind schedule. Dr. Whitmore had already made 2 pointed references to the time. The audience, about 30 people now, was restless in the way that conference audiences get mid-morning, reaching for phones and coffee cups. Amara walked to the front of the room. She placed her printed materials on the podium. She looked up. 30 faces looked back at her, some curious, some politely blank. Some already sliding toward the expression of people who have decided something isn't worth their full attention before it has begun. She began speaking. "My name is Amara Osei. I'm 14 years old, and I'm a student in Baltimore, Maryland. For the past 14 months, I've been studying anomalous behavior in particle energy measurements at theoretical boundary conditions. Specifically, what I believe is a systematic deviation from the predictions of the Hargreave-Stanton equation. The room shifted. Not dramatically, but noticeably. A few people straightened slightly, a few others exchanged a glance. Dr. Whitmore, seated at the moderator's table to the side, made a quiet sound, not quite a laugh. Something smaller than that, something dismissive in a way that didn't require full commitment. Amara continued. She laid out her premise clearly and methodically. The anomalies in existing data sets, the patterns she'd identified across 17 separate studies, the mathematical derivation she had built to explain it. She spoke the way Dr. Owens had taught her to speak, without apology, without over-explanation, without the nervous filler words that people use when they're seeking permission to be heard. She spoke as if what she was saying was simply obviously true, because she believed it was. She was 3 minutes in when the first interruption came. "Excuse me, doctor." Whitmore's voice cut through cleanly. "You said you're 14? "Yes," Amara said. "And this research, you conducted it yourself, at home?" The word home carried weight in the way he said it. Amara felt it land. "Yes," she said again, "with access to published data sets through my library's academic database and guidance from Dr. Gerald Owens, formerly of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center." A small murmur moved through the room. Whitmore's expression didn't change much, but something in his posture shifted. "I see," he said. "Please continue," she continued, but the room had changed. She could feel it, the subtle withdrawal of charitable attention, the way some people's eyes had gone from cautiously engaged to something flatter. She recognized the feeling from every classroom she'd ever been ahead of. Every conversation where she had offered something true and felt the other person's face close slightly because they hadn't expected the truth to come from her. She kept going. She reached the core of her argument, the mathematical derivation she had spent 4 months developing, and turned to the whiteboard to begin writing it out. That was when she heard it, a low laugh, not from Whitmore, from somewhere in the middle rows, quiet but not quiet enough. And then a voice, she would never see whose, that said, in a tone of such comfortable condescension that it clearly didn't feel the need to be whispered. "Is this a science fair project?" The room didn't react with outrage. That was the thing that would stay with Amara longest afterward. Nobody pushed back. Nobody said that's inappropriate or please let her finish. A few people had the decency to look uncomfortable. Most simply looked away, and Dr. Whitmore at the moderator's table cleared his throat and said, "Let's try to stay focused. You have about 4 minutes remaining." 4 minutes. He had given the Caltech professor an extra 8 minutes beyond his allotted time. Amara's hand was on the marker. She had not yet started writing. The derivation she needed to show them would take 12 minutes minimum to explain properly. 12 minutes of careful, step-by-step mathematical logic. She had 4. She stood at the whiteboard for 1 breath. 2. Then she put the marker down, gathered her folder, and returned to her seat without finishing. Because she understood, with absolute clarity, that nothing she wrote on that board in the next 4 minutes would be given a fair hearing. And she would not present an incomplete version of her work and let that incomplete version become the reason it was dismissed. She would wait. She would find another way. What she didn't know yet was that the worst moment was still coming. And that moment, the one that would push everything past the point of ignoring, was closer than she thought after the morning session ended. There was a coffee break in the hallway outside the conference room. Amara stood near the window with her folder and a glass of water, watching the senior researchers cluster in easy conversations, laughing, using first names with each other. The comfortable shorthand of people who share a world. Dr. Owens had not been able to attend. He'd had a medical appointment that couldn't be moved, but he had arranged for a colleague of his to be there, a doctor. Patricia Huang from Georgetown, who had agreed to look out for Amara and potentially facilitate introductions. Dr. Huang found her at the window. She was warm, efficient, mid-50s, with the quick eyes of someone who missed nothing. "Your opening was excellent," she said quietly, handing Amara a name card. "Clear, confident. You set the framing well." "I didn't get to finish," Amara said. "I know, I noticed." Dr. Huang's expression was careful. "Charles Whitmore is a particular kind of man. He has opinions about what belongs in rooms like this. Opinions about who belongs, Amara said. Dr. Huang looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said, that too. Across the hallway, Amara saw Dr. Whitmore standing with two other men, both senior, both holding coffee cups, both with the easy stance of men who felt entirely at home. One of them said something and Whitmore laughed, a real laugh, full and generous, the kind he had not once offered in the direction of the podium that morning. Amara watched him, not with anger. With something more patient than anger. She had 4 notebooks at home. She had 14 months of work. She had an equation that she was increasingly certain was correct. And she had every published data set she had used to derive it. She didn't need his permission to be right. She needed an opportunity to prove it. The question was whether that opportunity would come. She had no idea, none, that it was already being arranged. Not by her, not by Dr. Huang, by the most unexpected person in the building. The afternoon session was not on Amara's original schedule. After the morning presentations, the symposium moved into what the program called Advanced Scholar Roundtables, smaller group discussions reserved for credentialed researchers. Amara had not been invited to these. Her participation in the event effectively ended after the young scholar spotlight. She was technically free to go home. She didn't go home. She found an empty chair in a corridor near the main conference room, opened her notebook, and kept working. If anything, the morning had sharpened her focus. Every dismissive glance, every careful look away, every quiet laugh, they had settled into her like ballast, steadying her rather than sinking her. Doctor. Huang checked on her once and left without saying much, which Amara respected. She didn't need to be comforted. She needed to work. What happened next came from a direction nobody expected. His name was Dr. Kweku Mensah. He was 53 years old, Ghanaian-born, and held a joint appointment in theoretical physics at the University of Cambridge and MIT. He had 2 honorary doctorates. He had been shortlisted for a Nobel 3 years running, and most people who followed the field assumed it was only a matter of time. He was also, as Amara would learn later, the reason the symposium was being held in Washington that year. He had helped organize it. And he had specifically insisted on including the young scholar spotlight because he believed, with some passion, that the most dangerous habit in academic science was the habit of gatekeeping brilliance. He came around the corridor corner at 2:15 that afternoon carrying a cup of coffee and a program booklet. He stopped when he saw Amara. He looked at her notebook. He looked at her. "You're the young woman from this morning," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," Amara said. He sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, but in a way that felt completely natural rather than presumptuous. He nodded at her notebook. "What are you working on?" Amara looked at him for one moment, the careful, calibrating look of someone who had learned not to offer her work carelessly to people who would handle it carelessly. Then she showed him. She didn't explain it first. She just turned the notebook toward him and let him read. Dr. Mensah was quiet for a long time. She watched his eyes move across the page, not quickly, but not struggling either, moving with the cadence of someone reading something dense but comprehensible. His expression didn't perform surprise. It performed something more serious than surprise. It performed recognition. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked. 14 months. 14 months. He repeated it as if tasting the number. Then, "Who helped you?" "Dr. Gerald Owens, some correspondence, and the library." A short silence. "You derived this from published datasets?" "Yes." He looked at the notebook again. He turned a page, turned another. "Your manipulation of the Hargreave-Stanton framing is—" He paused. "It's unconventional." "I know," Amara said. "That's the point. The conventional framing hides the error because it uses the same assumptions the original equation was built on. I had to step outside the framework to see the anomaly clearly." Dr. Mensah looked up at her. There was something in his expression that was, unmistakably, the expression of someone who has just seen something they did not expect to see. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amara Osei." He nodded slowly. Then, as if making a decision, "There's a session this afternoon, an advanced round table on theoretical boundary applications. It's closed to non-credentialed attendees." He looked at her carefully. "I want you to come." Amara kept her expression steady the way her father had taught her. "They'll let me in?" she asked. "I'll make sure of it," he said. And that single small decision, made in a corridor over a cup of coffee, was the hinge on which everything turned. The advanced round table was held in Conference Room B, a smaller space with a long oval table, chairs arranged around it, and the kind of low lighting that suggested serious conversation. There were 12 researchers when Amara and Dr. Mensah arrived. By the time the session began, there were 18. Word had moved quietly through the afternoon break that Mensah wanted a focused discussion on boundary condition anomalies, and people came for that. What they did not expect was Amara. Dr. Whitmore was there. He was seated near the head of the table, in the position of informal authority he seemed to occupy in most rooms. When he saw Amara walk in behind Mensah, something moved across his face, a brief flicker of irritation, quickly smoothed. He said nothing. Mensah's presence and reputation made saying something directly inadvisable, but the room felt it, the slight shift in temperature. The pointed way that nobody made direct eye contact with Amara as she found a seat near the middle of the table. Mensah opened the discussion in the measured way of someone who knows exactly what he is doing. He framed the theoretical problem generally, boundary condition anomalies in particle energy measurements, the pattern of data inconsistencies in the existing literature, the question of whether the Hargreave-Stanton equation adequately predicted behavior across all energy thresholds. Standard territory, the senior researchers leaned in with comfortable authority. Then he said, "I'd like to open the floor to anyone who has thoughts on why these anomalies have historically been dismissed rather than investigated." "Amara, do you want to start?" The table went almost audibly quiet, not the previous quiet, a different kind. The kind that happens when a social assumption has been broken and everyone is deciding how to respond. Whitmore set down his pen. Amara felt 18 pairs of eyes move to her. She felt the weight of the room's skepticism settle around her like weather. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She set her hands flat on the table. She breathed once. "The anomalies are dismissed," she said clearly, "because the researchers who found them used the Hargreave-Stanton framework to evaluate them. Which means they were using the same foundational assumptions that created the error in the first place. It's like using a broken ruler to check whether the ruler is broken. You need to step outside the measurement system to see the flaw." Silence. Then Whitmore spoke. Calmly, professionally, with the measured tone of a man who knows how to be condescending without raising his voice. "That's a colorful metaphor," he said. "But the Hargreave-Stanton equation has held under rigorous peer review for 63 years. The anomalies you're referring to have been examined by qualified researchers and determined to fall within acceptable margin ranges. The margins were set by the same framework," Amara said. "The margins are part of the problem. I understand that may seem logical from an outside perspective," Whitmore said, and the words asterisk outside perspective landed with complete intentionality. "But theoretical physics isn't simply a matter of pattern spotting in published datasets. It requires deep institutional knowledge, peer-reviewed methodology, and years of specialized training." He paused. Then, with the smile of a man who believes he's being generous, "You're clearly a bright young woman, but I think you may be out of your depth here." The table was very still. Several people were looking at the center of the table. A few were looking at Mensah. Mensah was looking at Whitmore with an expression that was completely composed and absolutely unreadable. Amara was looking directly at Dr. Whitmore. "May I write something on the board?" she asked. Whitmore blinked. "I beg your pardon? I'd like to show you the mathematical derivation." "Not describe it, show it. Full notation step by step." She paused. "If I'm out of my depth, the math will show that. And if the math holds, then the argument holds regardless of my training or my age." Another silence, and then Dr. Mensah said very simply, "That seems fair." Whitmore's jaw tightened for just a moment. Then he gestured toward the whiteboard at the side of the room with the particular grace of a man who believes he is being tolerant. "By all means," he said. He had no idea what he had just agreed to. Amara stood up and walked to the whiteboard. She picked up the marker. She turned to face the room for one moment, not dramatically, not as a performance. Just a brief, still moment of internal settling, the kind that athletes do before a race. The kind that tells you someone knows exactly what they're about to do. Then she turned to the board and began to write. The derivation she wrote was 47 lines long, not because it needed to be dramatic or impressive, because that was the length required to demonstrate rigorously and completely what she had found. She didn't skip steps. She didn't assume her audience would fill in gaps. She wrote each line clearly, labeled each transition, and moved from first principles through the existing Hargreave-Stanton structure to the point where the deviation appeared, and then showed, in precise mathematical language, why the deviation wasn't random noise, but a structural consequence of an incomplete initial assumption. She wrote for 8 minutes straight without pausing. The room was, by the halfway point, a different room from the one she had started in. She could feel it without looking. The shift in the quality of attention, the change in the kind of silence, from the skeptical silence of people waiting for a mistake to the focused silence of people who are trying to keep up. She heard the sound of pens on paper. People were taking notes. She kept writing. When she reached line 34, the critical juncture, the point where her derivation diverged from the standard framework and revealed the incompleteness, she heard something she had not expected to hear. A sharp intake of breath, just one, from somewhere on the left side of the table. She didn't turn to see who it came from. She kept writing. Line 35, 36. The pen scratching against paper across the room had stopped. Every person at that table had gone still, not the restless stillness of people tolerating something, but the locked stillness of people who have stopped thinking about anything else. Line 37, 38, she heard Whitmore shift in his chair. She heard the specific quality of that shift, not the comfortable repositioning of someone waiting patiently, but the tighter, more careful movement of someone who has seen something unexpected and is not yet sure what to do with it. Line 40, 41. Dr. Mensah had not moved once since she began writing. He sat with his arms folded loosely on the table, his chin slightly forward, and his eyes tracking every line with the focused patience of a man reading something he wants to read correctly before he reacts to it. Line 44, 45. She was close now. She could feel the culmination of 14 months pulling toward this point the way water pulls toward a drain, inevitable, precise, almost physical. Line 46. She wrote the final line, the 47th. She set the conclusion cleanly at the bottom right of the board, circled it once, and set the marker down on the tray. Then she turned around and looked at the room. What she saw in those faces would stay with her for the rest of her life, not the shock, though that was there. Not the silence, though that was deafening. What she would remember most, the thing that would mean the most to her 20 years later when she was asked to describe that moment in an interview, was this. For the first time since she had walked into that building at 9:45 that morning, nobody in that room was looking past her. They were all looking directly at her. The silence lasted approximately 6 seconds. Amara would count them later, turning the memory over in her mind. 6 seconds is longer than it sounds when 37 years of institutional authority are sitting across a conference table from a 14-year-old girl, waiting for someone to tell her she's wrong. It was a researcher from MIT, Dr. Yves Bernard, a compact Frenchman in his late 40s who specialized in quantum field theory, who spoke first. He spoke not to the room, but to the board, as if he were speaking directly to the equations themselves. The transition at line 34, he said. His voice was careful, precise. You've reframed the boundary assumption using the original energy distribution rather than the normalized output. He stopped. That's why the anomalies disappeared in previous analyses. They were normalizing away the deviation. Yes, Amara said. Bernard turned to look at her. And you derived this from the published datasets alone. You didn't have access to raw experimental data. Only what's publicly available, she confirmed. The deviation appears in the published numbers if you approach the equation from outside its own framework. Bernard leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He rubbed the side of his face with one hand. It was the movement of a man recalibrating something important. Around the table, other researchers were doing different versions of the same thing. One woman, Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid from King Abdullah University, had pulled out her own notepad and was furiously writing something, glancing up at the board between lines. Two researchers near the far end were having a rapid, low-voiced conversation in Japanese, pointing alternately at the board and at each other's notes. And Dr. Whitmore was sitting very still. Not the composed stillness of authority, a different kind of stillness. The particular stillness of a man who has built a lot of what he believes on a foundation that a 14-year-old girl from Baltimore has just put under serious question, and who is not sure, for the first time in a very long time, what he is supposed to say next. His pen was on the table in front of him. He had not picked it up since approximately line 28. The notes he had started taking, the ones that had clearly been heading toward a confident refutation, sat unfinished in his legal pad. Amara saw all of this in one sweep of the room. She catalogued it without expression. Then Dr. Mensah spoke. "I want to be very precise here," he said to the room in the measured cadence of a man who chooses precision as a form of respect. "What we're looking at, if this derivation holds under rigorous independent review, is a structural incompleteness in the Hargreave-Stanton equation, not a minor adjustment. A foundational modification with implications for how we model particle behavior across all high-energy threshold experiments." He paused. "The implications for the last 6 decades of research in this area would be significant. Would need verification," someone said quickly from the far end of the table. The tone was defensive rather than skeptical, the tone of a person who knows something might be true and is buying time. "Of course," Mensah agreed calmly. "But first principles verification of the derivation itself shouldn't take long. The math is either right or it isn't." He looked at Amara. "Would you be willing to walk through the derivation step by step, answer questions?" "That's what I came here to do this morning," Amara said quietly. Something moved through the room at that. Not quite shame, something adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of people who are realizing that what they allowed to happen this morning, the cut time, the dismissive tone, the quiet laugh. The science fair comment was not a neutral professional decision, but a mistake that had consequences. A mistake that was, right now, actively embarrassing them in front of the person they had made it about. Whitmore cleared his throat. He picked up his pen. He did not look directly at Amara. "Let's proceed with the walkthrough," he said. His voice was perfectly professional, completely steady. But Amara noticed, and she would notice it for years afterward, that he could not quite bring himself to call her by name. Could not quite bring himself to say Miss Osei or Amara or this young woman. He simply gestured toward the board and said, "Let's proceed," as if the source of the work was a detail he was no longer comfortable with in the way he had been comfortable with it an hour ago. Good, Amara thought it should feel different now. The walkthrough took 45 minutes. Amara went line by line, every line. When researchers asked questions, and they asked many good ones, hard ones, the kind that poked at the joints of an argument looking for weakness, she answered without hesitation. Not because she had rehearsed every possible challenge, but because she understood her own work deeply enough to respond in real time. "Doctor." Bernard challenged her at line 22, questioning her variable substitution. She showed him 3 different approaches that all arrived at the same result. "Doctor." Al-Rashid pressed her on the second boundary assumption, asking whether the deviation persisted under variable energy thresholds or only at the specific range Amara had tested. Amara pulled out her notebook, the worn black one with the tilted handwriting, and showed her 4 additional datasets she had tested the same derivation against. 4 datasets. She had anticipated the question and tested it. Bernard looked at the notebook and said, quietly, to nobody in particular. She ran it against 4 independent datasets. The 2 Japanese researchers had grown progressively more animated in their low-voiced exchange. At the 40-minute mark, one of them, a doctor, Hiroshi Tanaka from RIKEN, interrupted the walkthrough to ask a question that took 4 minutes to fully articulate because he was simultaneously excited and careful, and the intersection of those 2 things required precision. The question was this: if Amara's derivation was correct, did it have implications not only for the Hargreave-Stanton equation, but for the related meridian field model that had been developed using Hargreave-Stanton as a foundational input? Amara was quiet for a moment. It was the first moment in 45 minutes that she had paused before answering. "I don't know yet," she said, "but yes. I think it probably does." The room absorbed that. Probably, Tanaka repeated, not sarcastically, thoughtfully. The full scope would need to be worked out, Amara said, carefully. By people with experimental access I don't have yet. Yet, she said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that it took the room a second to register the word. Yet, not a boast, not a demand. Just a statement of direction, a 17-year-old's relationship with the future. Dr. Mensah had been quiet through most of the walkthrough. He had watched, taken his own notes, and only occasionally asked a clarifying question. Now he set down his pen and looked at Amara. "Is there anything in your derivation you are not certain about?" he asked, not as a trap. As a genuine question, the kind of question you ask someone whose intellectual honesty matters to you. Amara thought for a moment. "The precision of the deviation coefficient at line 37, she said. "I've calculated it 3 different ways and gotten consistent results, but I'd want it independently verified against experimental data, not just published sets." The experimental data might show a slightly different value. Bernard looked up sharply at that. "You're flagging your own potential imprecision. I know what I can verify with the tools I have," Amara said, "and I know what I can't." "Those are different things." Another silence settled over the room, but this silence was different from every silence that had come before it. It wasn't skeptical. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't even the cautiously respectful silence of people who have been surprised. It was the silence of people who are genuinely thinking, processing, following a thought wherever it leads regardless of where they expected it to go when they walked into the room that morning. It was, Amara realized slowly, the silence of being taken seriously. It was 3:42 in the afternoon. She had been in that building for almost 6 hours. Her notebook was open on the table in front of her. The whiteboard behind her was covered in 47 lines of mathematics. And somewhere in the back of her mind, quietly, she thought of her mother pressing her blouse that morning. Of her father driving the 40 miles in the school bus. Of Dr. Owens at his kitchen table with his Earl Grey tea saying, "If this is right, it is not a small thing." She had known that. She had always known that. And now, finally, the room was beginning to understand it too. But understanding and acknowledging are 2 different things. And what was about to happen next would force the room to decide, publicly and on record, exactly which one they were willing to do. The round table had run 90 minutes past its scheduled end time. Nobody had left. That detail alone said everything. These were researchers with packed conference schedules, competing sessions, flights to catch, careers that moved at the speed of institution. When 18 of them stayed in a room 90 minutes past their commitment, something genuine was happening. Dr. Mensah called a 10-minute break. People stood stretched, moved to the coffee station at the side of the room. Conversations broke out in clusters, the focused. Rapid-fire conversations of people who have been in the presence of something they need to process with another human being before they can fully believe it. Amara stayed at the whiteboard. She reread her own derivation slowly, as if checking it one more time. She wasn't really checking it. She was giving herself space to breathe. "Doctor." Whitmore walked past her toward the coffee station. He did not stop. He did not say anything. But as he passed, his eyes moved involuntarily to the board, to line 34 specifically, the critical pivot, and Amara caught that glance in her peripheral vision. It was brief, almost furtive, the glance of a man who keeps looking at something he's not sure how to incorporate into what he already believes. She said nothing. She watched him pour his coffee. She watched him move to the far side of the room and stand slightly apart from the nearest cluster of colleagues. He looked, for the first time since she had seen him, like a man who wasn't entirely sure where he was supposed to stand. Dr. Al-Rashid came to stand beside Amara at the whiteboard. She was direct and warm in the way of someone who had no patience for performance in either direction, neither condescension nor excessive praise. "How are you?" she asked. "I'm okay," Amara said. "You handled this room beautifully." It wasn't flattery, it was a professional observation. "I just showed the math," Amara said. Al-Rashid smiled slightly. "That's not as simple as you make it sound. Especially in this room." She paused. "I want you to know something. What you've done here today, the work, yes, but also the way you've conducted yourself, is not ordinary. I'm not saying that to make you feel good. I'm saying it so you carry it with you accurately." Amara looked at her. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it not the automatic thank you of politeness, but the full, deliberate thank you of someone who receives something real and wants to honor it. When the break ended and people settled back around the table, the quality of the room had changed again. There was a forward-leaning energy now, a momentum. People had talked to each other, had compared reactions, had arrived independently and collectively at the same place. Dr. Mensah resumed the session. "I want to ask the room a question," he said. Not as the co-organizer of this symposium, as a physicist. He looked around the table steadily. Based on what we've seen this afternoon, the derivation, the walkthrough, the responses to your challenges, do any of you have a mathematical objection to what's on that board? The room was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people avoiding the question. The careful quiet of people giving the question the honest attention it deserved. Dr. Bernard spoke first. "No mathematical objection," he said. "Not at this stage. The derivation is internally consistent, and the logic of stepping outside the framework to expose the framework's assumption is sound." He paused. "I'd want independent verification of the coefficient at 37, as she flagged herself. But the architecture of the argument?" He shook his head slowly. "I have no objection." A researcher from Oxford, a woman named Dr. Catherine Brooke, who had been mostly quiet throughout, spoke next. "The implications she raised for the meridian field model are something I'd need time to work through," she said. "But I can't find an error in what's on that board." And I've been looking. One by one, around the table, the researchers weighed in. Most were careful, precise. "I find no objection at this stage, pending verification." A few were slightly more expansive. None said they had found a flaw. 17 researchers. 17 versions of the same conclusion. Mensah reached the end of the table. He had left one person for last. "Charles," he said, not unkindly, but with an exactness that was the academic equivalent of placing something on a table and stepping back. Dr. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. His legal pad was in front of him. His pen was in his hand. He looked at the pad, then at the board, then at a point somewhere between them. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man choosing his words with extreme and uncharacteristic care. "The derivation is," he paused, "more rigorous than I initially assessed." Another pause. "The framework critique is methodologically interesting. I would want peer review and independent experimental verification before drawing significant conclusions." A beat of silence. "But," he continued, and the word cost him something visible, "I cannot identify a mathematical error." There it was, not an apology, not a full acknowledgement of the morning's treatment. Not a recognition of what he had said and implied and allowed to happen in that room before lunch. But in the language of that particular world, the world of credentialed authority and institutional standing, and 63 years of an unchallenged equation, I cannot identify a mathematical error. From Dr. Charles Whitmore, Nobel laureate, said about the work of a 14-year-old black girl from Baltimore was something. It was something significant, but even that wasn't the moment. Even that wasn't the thing that would make the room go completely, absolutely, breathlessly silent. That was still coming. Dr. Mensah reached into the leather bag beside his chair and removed a folder. He set it on the table in front of him and looked at it for a moment before speaking. "I want to tell you all something," he said. "And I want you to understand that I'm telling you this now, after the walkthrough, after your assessments, because the sequence matters." He had the full attention of every person in the room. 3 weeks ago," he said, "I received a copy of Amara's research through a mutual colleague, Dr. Gerald Owens. I read it carefully over 2 days. I then sent it, without the author's name or any identifying information, to 3 of my former graduate students. All 3 are now senior researchers. 2 have published extensively in this area. I asked them to evaluate the derivation on its merits." He opened the folder. "Their responses are here. I'll summarize." He glanced at the first page. Respondent 1. The derivation is internally consistent, and the core argument, that the anomalies result from a structural incompleteness in the foundational assumption rather than measurement error, is compelling. I would want experimental verification of the coefficient, but I see no flaw in the logic. Respondent 2. This is some of the most creative theoretical work I've seen in this area in a decade. Whoever did this stepped outside an entire framework to see its blind spot, That's genuinely rare. He turned to the third page. Respondent 3, I went through this 3 times looking for the error. I didn't find one. If this holds up under experimental verification, it's a significant result. I'd like to know who did this work. He set the folder down. None of them, he said carefully, were told anything about the author, not the age, not the background, not the institutional affiliation or lack thereof. They evaluated the mathematics, that is all. The room received that in complete silence. Amara's hands were flat on the table in front of her. She had not known about this. Mensa had not told her. She felt the information land in her chest with a weight that was warm and clean and something close to overwhelming. And she kept her face still and her spine straight because she had learned a very long time ago that showing the fullness of your feelings in rooms that have not yet earned them is a form of vulnerability you cannot always afford. But her eyes were bright. Dr. Mensa looked at the room, then he looked at Amara. You were dismissed this morning, he said, quickly and without cause. Not because your work was insufficient. We have now established clearly that it is not insufficient. You were dismissed because of assumptions. He did not look at Whitmore when he said this. He didn't need to. Assumptions about what a person who looks like you, who is as young as you, who comes from the background you come from, assumptions about what such a person can or cannot have produced. About what they deserve to be heard. He picked up his pen. He wrote something on the cover of the folder and slid it across the table toward Amara. She looked at it. It was a name, an email address, and a phone number. Below that, 4 words, call me on Monday. I want to discuss a formal research collaboration, he said, between you, myself, and potentially Dr. Bernard and Dr. Al-Rashid if they're interested. He looked at them briefly. They were interested, both nodded without hesitation. A fully supported, properly resourced investigation of your findings, with experimental access and peer review infrastructure. He paused. You've done extraordinary work with a library database and a notebook. It's time you had real tools. Amara looked at the paper. She looked at Dr. Mensa. Thank you, she said, 2 words. The same 2 words she had said to Dr. Al-Rashid earlier. But the weight in them now was different, fuller, deeper. The weight of 14 months and a 5:15 morning and a worn black notebook and a father who drove her 40 miles in a school bus and a mother who pressed her blouse. The weight of being right and having to wait for the world to be ready to hear it. And then something happened that nobody in that room had scripted or anticipated or planned. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, the researcher from RIKEN who had asked the most technically demanding question of the afternoon, who had pressed her hardest and received the most complete answer, stood up from his chair. He stood up and he began to applaud, not enthusiastically, not performatively, the deliberate, slow applause of a man who means every beat of it. Dr. Bernard stood, then Dr. Al-Rashid, then Dr. Brooke, then the 2 researchers at the far end of the table, then more. One by one they stood, not all of them, and not immediately, but enough, and with enough sincerity that the ones who stayed seated felt the weight of remaining seated. Amara sat very still for 1 moment, then she rose. She stood at the whiteboard. In front of 47 lines of mathematics, she had written from memory in a conference room full of people who had not expected her to be there, people who were now. Imperfectly and belatedly, and with the particular awkwardness of people acknowledging something they should have acknowledged earlier, standing for her. She did not smile broadly, she did not gesture or perform, she simply stood straight, shoulders back, the quiet dignity of someone who never doubted the work, even when the world doubted the person. Dr. Whitmore did not stand. He remained in his seat, his pen in his hand, his legal pad in front of him. He was looking at the center of the table. Nobody called attention to it. Nobody needed to. The absence spoke for itself. The symposium ended at 5 o'clock. People collected bags and folders and business cards, made plans to follow up. Exchanged information with the particular focused warmth of researchers who have spent an afternoon in the same productive direction and want to continue. The conversations were different from the morning ones, less performed, more real, the conversation of people who have been genuinely changed by something. Dr. Mensa walked Amara to the lobby. Dr. Huang was there, waiting. She had heard from 3 separate people what had happened in conference room B. And her expression when she saw Amara was the expression of someone who is relieved in a way that is also slightly painful, because relief implies that another outcome had been possible. "Your father's outside," Dr. Huang told Amara. "He's been there since 4. Amara nodded. She thanked Dr. Mensah again, properly looking at him, meaning it. She thanked Dr. Huang. She shook hands with Dr. Bernard, who had come to say goodbye and to confirm, one more time, that he would be in touch. Then she walked out through the glass doors of the conference center. Quaim was parked at the curb in his school bus, not because it was the vehicle he would have chosen for the occasion. Because it was the vehicle he had, and it had gotten her here this morning, and it would get her home tonight, and that was what mattered. He was standing outside it, arms folded, in the particular posture he used when he was trying to look calm but was not fully calm. He had not been told everything that had happened. He had received 2 texts from Dr. Huang across the afternoon. "She's doing well and just wait." And he had spent the intervening hours doing what Quaim Os did when there was nothing else to do. Being exactly where he was supposed to be and waiting. Amara walked to him. He looked at her face, studied it the way parents read their children's faces, looking not for performance but for truth. He found truth, his arms unfolded. He put them around his daughter. She let him. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and then into his shoulder. "It worked, Dad." A short silence. "I know," he said. He hadn't known, he had hoped. He had driven 40 miles in a school bus on hope. The way he had driven from Accra to Accra International Airport 22 years ago on hope. The way he had made every difficult bet of his life on the quiet conviction that the work mattered, that the truth would land somewhere solid eventually. That dignity was not contingent on other people's recognition of it. He held his daughter for a long moment, then he stepped back, held her by the shoulders, looked at her. "Tell me everything," he said. She did. On the 40-mile drive home in the school bus, the fluorescent interior lights humming, the highway unspooling ahead of them, she told him everything. The morning session, the cut time. The laugh she hadn't imagined, the corridor and Dr. Mensah, conference room B, the 47 lines, the responses from the 3 anonymous reviewers, the folder, the offer. Quaim listened. He drove and he listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dr. Owens was right." "About what?" "When he said it was not a small thing." He glanced at her. "It was never a small thing." Abina cried when they got home. She cried, and then she fed Amara a full dinner, and then she made her go to bed at a reasonable time because tomorrow was still a school day. And some things remain true regardless of what else happens to be true simultaneously. Kofi and Emmanuel wanted to know if their sister was famous now. Amara told them not yet. They seemed only mildly disappointed. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded with the careful, documented pace of academic life. Dr. Mensah formalized the research collaboration offer in writing. Amara's parents, Quaim being particularly thorough, reviewed the terms carefully, consulted with 2 lawyers, asked 9 specific questions, and then signed. Dr. Bernard reached out to 2 colleagues at CERN regarding experimental access for the coefficient verification. The response was positive and faster than anyone expected. A formal peer review process was initiated for Amara's derivation. The review panel, 5 researchers, selected by Mensah and Bernard, completed their assessment in 11 weeks. Their conclusion, the derivation was sound. The incompleteness in the Hargreave-Stanton equation was real. The implications for related models were significant and would require systematic further investigation. The paper, co-authored by Amara, Mensah, Bernard, and Al-Rashid, was submitted to physical review letters. It was accepted after 2 rounds of revision. The title was technical and precise, the way good physics paper titles are. But the abstract, which Amara had written the first draft of, contained a single sentence near the end that several reviewers noted was unusually clear for a physics paper. The anomaly was always present in the data. It was the framework of observation, not the phenomenon itself, that prevented us from seeing it. She was 15 by the time the paper was published. As for Dr. Whitmore, he did not lose his job. He did not face a formal consequence for what happened in that conference room. The world is rarely that symmetrical, but the paper was published. His name was not on it. His assessment of the work, I cannot identify a mathematical error. was on record among the 18 people who had been in conference room B that afternoon, and in the months that followed. As the paper circulated, and the response from the physics community grew from cautious interest to genuine attention, that record sat quietly in the background. Several colleagues who had been in the room, and who had said nothing during the morning session, reached out to Amara personally in the months after publication. Their messages were variations on the same theme, acknowledgement, belated but real, that something had happened that shouldn't have, that they should have said something and hadn't. That they were sorry. Amara responded to each of them, graciously, briefly. She did not carry grudges, she carried work. Dr. Owens received a call from Mensa the week the paper was accepted. He listened to the summary without interrupting, thanked Mensa sincerely, hung up, and sat in his kitchen for a while with his Earl Grey tea. Then he called Amara. She answered on the second ring. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you, Dr. Owens," she said, "for everything." A quiet pause on the line. "You did the work," he said. "You believed it was worth doing," she said. Another pause. "Longer this time." "I did," he said softly. "I always did." There is a particular kind of story we tell ourselves, comfortable, familiar, about how brilliance is recognized. In this story, genius announces itself plainly and the world responds accordingly. The extraordinary mind walks into the room and the room knows. Doors open, hands are extended, the work is seen. Amara Osei's story tells us something more honest than that. It tells us that brilliance and the recognition of brilliance are two entirely separate things, and that the space between them is not empty. It is filled with the very human tendencies that have always governed who we choose to listen to, who we give time to, who we assume has something worth hearing before they have said a word. Amara was not lucky that day. She was not saved by someone swooping in at the last moment. She had done the work. 14 months of it, in a kitchen at 5:15 in the morning, in a library that let her stay past closing. In a community center back office with a retired NASA physicist who was paying attention when others weren't. What Dr. Mensa gave her was not a rescue. It was an opening that her preparation, her patience, and her dignity had earned the right to walk through. The questions her story leaves behind are the ones worth sitting with. How many times does this happen without a Dr. Mensa in the corridor? How many notebooks full of real, rigorous, important work are dismissed because the person holding them doesn't match the mental image of who is supposed to be holding them? How much do we lose, collectively, as a species that depends on good ideas to solve its most serious problems, when we let assumptions do the work that attention should be doing? And what about the other side of it, the side that Amara herself represents? The patience, the discipline of saving your energy for what matters. The decision to present an incomplete version of your work to a hostile room, and then, with remarkable self-possession, to set the marker down and wait for a better moment rather than let your work be dismissed on unfair terms. That is not passivity, that is strategy. That is the quiet power of someone who knows that the truth doesn't expire. That it will still be true tomorrow, and the day after, and the day when the room is finally ready to hear it. Amara Osei was 14 years old. She was carrying a worn black notebook and a navy blue folder. She arrived in a school bus and she was given 4 minutes to explain 14 months of work. She set the marker down. She waited. She came back and the math was still right. The math was always right. Sometimes the people we underestimate are the ones who will rewrite what we thought we knew. Sometimes the most important work being done right now is being done in a place we haven't thought to look, by someone we haven't thought to ask. And sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't the dramatic confrontation. It isn't the speech or the outburst or the moment of righteous defiance. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is to keep going, quietly, persistently, with dignity intact, until the world catches up with the truth that you have been carrying the whole time. If this story moved you, if Amara's patience and persistence and the quiet power of her mathematics reminded you of something important about dignity and truth, and what it means to keep going, then I'd be genuinely grateful if you'd subscribe to hear more stories like this. These are the stories that deserve to be told. The ones that don't always make the headline because the headline only captures the moment of triumph and not the years of work that made it possible. The ones that remind us what human beings are capable of, when we refuse to let other people's limitations become our own. Amara Osei rewrote a 63-year-old equation at 14 years old in a room that didn't want to hear it. And she did it with grace. That's worth knowing about. But if this story of quiet triumph stirred something in you, just wait. Because what happened when a 72-year-old man with no formal education walked into a courtroom full of Ivy League lawyers and turned everything upside down before anyone understood what they were watching? That story will make you question everything you think you know about intelligence, preparation, and who the world decides to take seriously. Until next time.